morning, everyone. I'm in Hong Kong, and I'm in the company of Pedro Eloy. He's the CEO of Pelham, and he's also the chair of the Youth and Women Entrepreneurship Taskforce from the United Nations, ESBN. And I also have the pleasure and the privilege of being part of that task force. So, Pedro, welcome to my hotshot.
My pleasure. Pleasure's all mine, Isabelle.
So, Pedro, for those who do not know this task force, maybe you can explain what it's all about and the main goal that you have?
Sure. So the task force has been created around a year and a half ago. It focuses primarily on Asia Pacific, and it tries to address the entrepreneurial ecosystems on all the different countries of the SCAP. So the SCAP is comprised of 53 countries and 9 associate member countries. And so the goal of the task force is to somehow, in one hand, plug in to these entrepreneurial ecosystems on the different countries, understand their dynamics, understand how they work, understand who's doing what, and on the second hand, start creating these connections that we can then ultimately plug in the local entrepreneurial ecosystems to what we call the global value chains.
Okay. And I know there's many challenges about encouraging youth and women entrepreneurship, but what, in your mind, if I ask you, what is the one main challenge from your point of view?
I would like to slightly backtrack from that question and say that when we speak about youth, we actually have to consider that they're going to be creating the present and the future that we are going to live in and our subsequent generations we're going to live in. So there's a huge importance being given by government and also by the civil society to fostering the youth in terms of education, in terms of programs, and in terms of a series of initiatives to allow them to replace the current generations that are somehow pushing countries and pushing economies forward. So I would say that the main challenge that they may be facing, and by the way, this is a huge basket of key points, I would say is probably the connection between the theory and the practice. So it's when it's going for the ideas or the innovation to the application. It's going from testing a product or a service to the implementation of the product or service, because if we look, for example, from an entrepreneurship perspective, we see that the initial phase, which is called the valley of death, which is where, say, Harvard Business School say that 92% of the startups will probably fail within the first couple of months. I think that will be the challenge, to ensure that this youth that can go into a more corporate environment or more in the entrepreneurial environment is to provide them this kind of midpoint between the theoretical, the education approach, the internship approach, until they can consider themselves as true professionals and truly contributing to the area that they're doing. So it's kind of this jump, or what I call the leapfrog, to allow them to kind of go from students or from young and experienced professionals to become someone that's actually leading something.
And in that same line of thought, I think also there's a difference between the concept and the real life. So the concept is very important, all the basic things that you need to apply to create a startup. But when you get into the real life, when you actually launch it in society, you have to be able to adjust and go with the flow. Because often you find actually the concept is good, but it's not really what applies in real life. So it's
absolutely. I'll just add to one more thing, is that if you look at some of the technology that we had, so we look at, say, the telephone, we look at the mobile phone, we look at things such as the internet. They went from the telephone accessible internet that used to take a couple of minutes before you used to be able to connect to something. If we look at the speed of things today, not only in terms of technology, but also in terms of the concepts that are being used today and are being innovated today. We're talking about the fintechs, we're talking about the biotechs, we're talking about the blockchain. The speed that these things happen cannot be sustained in this kind of classic progressive environment. So I think that the youth will realize that probably what they study in 1 year, or probably what they're working in 1 year, they will have to be actively seeking continued development, because the world is changing very fast and all these technologies making things changing very fast. This will kind of allow us to go for a longer interview. So if we talk about subjects like artificial intelligence, where it's going to replace the workforce, especially in places like Asia Pacific, where it's very labor-intensive workforce. So these societies, these youth will have to be prepared to, today they work in a factory, or today they work in a job that potentially can be disrupted by artificial intelligence. So what's going to happen next to this youth and to these countries? So I think that the youth will have this big challenge that, in one hand, we have the theory jump to the practice, and on the other side we also have the speed that all the content that we learned at school, or we learn in our first jobs or in our first startup, we have to relearn very fast to be always at the edge of what's coming next.
And actually, you're giving me a very good segue to my last question, which is the fact that enterprises, large enterprises, have to move at that speed, and they're not really equipped to do so. And I truly believe that incorporating the startup, at least the startup mindset in large enterprises, is key. But what do you think? Well, how do you see the importance of startups in the success of our large enterprises going forward?
I like the term that you mentioned, startup, because if we kind of go up one level, every big corporation was once a startup, right?
True.
So every big telecom was once a startup. Every Microsoft, every Macintosh, every Ford, Tesla, all of these guys were created somewhere out of an idea. So they all started as a startup. What we've seen is that then they get the two sides of the supply chain. So in one hand, they've got the access to all the suppliers, so they can very quickly produce something to market, and they have all this kind of variety of scale. But on the other side, they also have all their database of customers. So, and this is probably one of the primary differences between the startup and the big corporations, that the startup is creating everything from new. They're creating the both sides of the supply chain. On one hand, they have to go to find the right suppliers, which they may go and trial and error for a couple of times. And on the other side, they have to find out the customers, so that become raving fans to start with, but also they become loyal customers. Now, what we also see is that as companies, that the big organizations, they grow into a larger scale, they become a beast on their own. So they become kind of a bit of a slow mover, as a dinosaur. And I believe that, and we're seeing more and more with plenty of big corporations, what they're doing is they're either creating their entrepreneur programs inside, so they're allocating a team for innovation, they're allocating a team that somehow can spur up all this innovative process inside and keep on reinventing themselves. But we also see a lot of companies, I mean, we had programs last year with, for example, Citibank, and there's many other companies doing this. With what they do is they may have their own innovation team inside, but what they also do is they're very keen on creating these programs to connect with the startups, with the latest startups, in a way that they can create this competition or this joint program where they can work together in a way that it is of benefit to the startup, because they can have like this kind of big parenthood company to work and their whole supply chain and their whole processes, but at the same time for the company who's probably moving at a more slower pace to kind of liaise with these early incumbents that are moving at a very fast speed and potentially suddenly raise their bar. So I believe that the future is this kind of connection. I think the future is also the spur of this innovation centers inside the corporations, but there's also a big challenge here. And I've been seeing this in many circumstances and in many companies, which is the big corporations, they have their own processes, they have their own policy, and they're also very focused on their customers. When they connect with the startup comes with the different types of behaviors, they come with the different types of modus operandis, they come with the different types of speed, and sometimes, or as a culprit or as a critical factor, if there's not what I call a flying fish, which is the interpreter that will somehow allow the startup to connect with the corporation, and at the same time the corporation to explain what it is to the startup that they can work alongside, this is where I see a lot of the failures, is that there's a keenness in the beginning for this work to work, for this cooperation to work, but once it starts working, there's a bit of a feeling that, okay, this will happen naturally, and it will not. So that's the part of this flying fish, which is a fish that can fly, but it's not a bird, and the bird that can swim, but it's not a fish. It's kind of this mid-term translation that can explain the corporate processes at the same time work with a startup to kind of ensure that they can reach to some result.
And I completely agree with you, which is why I'm part of your Taskforce.
Absolutely, and we really welcome you to be part of the task force.
So, we have to come up with the goods and create some activity
I'm sure
and
we will.
bring together the enterprise and the startups, in my case, in the telecom world. So thank you, Pedro.
My pleasure, Isabelle. My pleasure, my pleasure.
No pressure on us.
No pressure whatsoever.
And thank you everyone for watching. And if you want to get involved in the exciting things that we're going to do this year, please let me know. And until my next hot shot.